There's a narrative being pushed right now, polished, controlled, almost too convenient. And if you look closely, you can feel the gap between what's being said and what's actually happening. The mainstream sports media is framing the WNBA preseason numbers like a success story, highlighting the buzz around the Indiana Fever matchup against the New York Liberty, presenting it as proof that everything is trending upward. But underneath that polished surface, there's another story unfolding, one that a deeply invested fan base is starting to notice. Because while headlines celebrate engagement, the data hints at something more complicated: a drop in sustained viewership, a quiet but significant number of people tuning out rather than leaning in. And that's where the tension begins to build. Because this isn't just about numbers, it's about why those numbers are shifting. Some fans are pointing toward head coach Stephanie White and her evolving offensive system, particularly the emphasis on off-ball movement, a strategic shift that hasn't fully landed the way many expected. For a team built around the on-ball brilliance of Caitlin Clark, that adjustment feels jarring to parts of the audience, almost like watching a different version of the identity they signed up for. And when expectations collide with execution, especially in a preseason window where curiosity is at its peak, reactions can be immediate. At the same time, there's a growing sense that the messaging coming from the front office hasn't aligned cleanly with what fans are seeing on the court. That disconnect, subtle at first, starts to widen when performance, strategy, and communication don't fully match. And in a league where attention is rapidly growing, every shift gets amplified, every inconsistency gets noticed. So while the public narrative leans toward optimism, the deeper conversation is becoming harder to ignore. Because this moment isn't just about a preseason game or a single ratings report, it's about perception, trust, and how quickly those things can change. The Fever are stepping into one of the most anticipated seasons in recent memory, carrying both excitement and scrutiny at the same time. And as the regular season approaches, the real question isn't just how the team performs, it's whether the story being told about them matches the reality fans are experiencing.
Telecast of the first preseason game of the year with the Indiana Fever and the New York Liberty. Let's keep it real, the two biggest teams in the league. The Indiana Fever and New York Liberty on Saturday, April 25th, delivered an average audience of 743,000. That is an increase of 76% over Ion's first preseason game last season. And I was like,
Right after the preseason clash between the Indiana Fever and the powerhouse New York Liberty on April 25th, the WNBA, alongside Ion Television, stepped forward with a number they wanted everyone to focus on: 743,000 average viewers. And almost instantly, the machine kicked into motion. Social media posts framed it like a breakthrough, headlines echoed the same tone, calling it the most watched preseason game in the network's history, highlighting a 76% jump from the previous year. On the surface, it feels like momentum, like growth, like validation. And to be fair, for a preseason game, that number is strong. It reinforces what everyone already understands about Caitlin Clark. Her presence alone can pull attention at a level few players ever reach. But here's where the story starts to split. Because when you step back and look beyond the headline, beyond the percentage increase, the full picture becomes more complicated. Analysts who track the league's economics didn't just celebrate the number, they questioned it. Not the figure itself, but what's missing from the way it's being presented. Growth compared to a smaller baseline can look dramatic, but it doesn't always tell you how deep that engagement really goes. It doesn't show how many viewers stayed, how many drifted away, or how the audience behaved across the full broadcast. And that's the part the public narrative tends to glide past. Because numbers can be framed to tell a story, but context decides whether that story holds up. What's emerging here isn't a simple success or failure. It's a layered reality. Yes, the draw is real. Yes, the interest is there. But at the same time, there are signals suggesting that not all of that attention is sticking the way the league might hope. So this moment sits in that tension, a milestone on one side, a question mark on the other. And as the season gets closer, those two sides are going to collide, because sustained attention, not just initial curiosity, is what ultimately defines whether this surge turns into something lasting or fades into another headline that sounded bigger than it really was.
Game. So I got to look and was like, well, that's a little suspicious. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I went to look. The Indiana Fever against Brazil on ESPN averaged 1.3 million viewers, peaking at 1.6. I don't know about you guys, just quick math.
Now here's where the numbers stop feeling like a celebration and start telling a very different story. In 2024, the Indiana Fever preseason showcase against the Brazilian national team pulled in a massive 1.3 million viewers on ESPN, even peaking at 1.6 million at its highest point. That wasn't just strong, it was a moment, the kind that signals real national attention. Fast forward to 2026, the hype is even bigger. The opponent is the defending Eastern Conference powerhouse, the New York Liberty, and yet the broadcast lands at 743,000 viewers. When you place those numbers side by side, the contrast is impossible to ignore. That's not a minor dip or a rounding error, that's a drop of roughly 43%, nearly half the audience gone. And that's where the narrative starts to crack, because while one version of the story highlights growth in a vacuum, this comparison forces a more uncomfortable question. How does a more hyped matchup with bigger expectations and more star power end up drawing significantly less attention than a preseason exhibition from 2 years earlier? It suggests that something deeper is happening beneath the surface, something that can't be explained by simple headlines or selective framing. This isn't about dismissing the current numbers. 743,000 is still a strong preseason figure, but context changes everything. Because when the baseline you're comparing to is 1.3 million, the conversation shifts from celebration to concern. It becomes less about how high the number is and more about why it didn't reach the level many expected. And that's the tension building around this moment, a gap between perception and reality that's getting harder to smooth over as more people start connecting the dots.
You may be like, well, Rhodes, it's ION versus ESPN Network. Yeah, I got you covered, folks. ESPN's available in 70 million homes, pay television households. The ION Network is available in over 100 million homes. And it's available in a combination of over-the-air broadcasting, which is your antenna. If you got a plain old antenna, you can watch ION. Cable and satellite. It's on Dish Network. It's on DirecTV. It's on YouTube TV. It's on. It's free on Roku. It's a streaming channel.
And this is where the conversation stops being surface level and starts getting uncomfortable, because the usual explanation doesn't fully hold up under pressure. Some analysts point out that ESPN naturally has a bigger pull than ION television, but that argument starts to crack when you look at how modern distribution actually works. ESPN sits behind a paywall, reaching around 70 million households that actively subscribe, while ION is free, accessible across more than 100 million homes through antennas and streaming platforms. On paper, that's a massive advantage in reach, a wider door, more potential viewers, fewer barriers. The game was easier to access, the matchup was stronger, the hype was louder, and yet the audience still fell by over 500,000 viewers compared to that 2024 moment. That's not something you can brush aside. Because when you zoom out, the pattern becomes clearer, and it centers around Caitlin Clark. In 2024, during her rookie surge, she wasn't just part of the biggest teams, she defined them. She appeared in 20 of the 23 WNBA matchups that crossed the 1 million viewer mark, an overwhelming share that reveals just how much of the league's visibility was tied directly to her presence. That's not normal balance, that's gravitational pull. And when she stepped away briefly in 2025 with injury, the numbers told an even sharper story. Viewership dropped by more than half during that stretch. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was immediate, almost like a switch had been flipped. So when the 2026 preseason opener lands at 743,000, instead of climbing toward or beyond that previous peak, the question isn't just about networks or scheduling anymore. It becomes something deeper, something more strategic. Are audiences responding differently to what they're seeing? Is the way Clark is being utilized changing how viewers connect with the game? Because attention doesn't just follow a name, it follows experience, style, identity. And that's where the focus starts to shift towards Stephanie White and the system being built, particularly the move toward a more off-ball structure. Because if the audience originally came to watch a certain kind of dominance, a certain rhythm, a certain style centered around Clark's on-ball creativity, then altering that formula, even slightly, can change how that experience feels. And when the experience changes, so does the engagement.
That's the deeper tension behind these numbers, not just whether the audience is there, but whether they're seeing what they expected to see.
If you guys aren't paying attention, there's a section of fans that are mad as hell right now. They're mad as... They don't want to see Caitlin Clark play off ball. They don't like Stephanie White's style of play. They don't want to watch slow basketball. They don't want the ball to be taken out of Caitlin's hands. They don't like how the Indiana Fever handled the injury last year and kept tagging fans.
The timing of this ratings conversation doesn't feel random at all. It feels deliberate, like something building beneath the surface finally breaking through. Because that Fever preseason game didn't just happen in isolation. It arrived at the end of a tense 2-week stretch, where the organization seemed to slowly distance itself from the very core of the Caitlin Clark fan base. And if you trace the noise, really follow it, from the April 13th draft to the April 25th preseason tip-off, you start to see a pattern forming. It wasn't just one moment, it was a chain reaction. Stephanie White making those controversial off-ball comments, leadership voices suggesting Clark needed to adjust, front office figures brushing off growing concerns, narratives shifting toward a combo guard identity, the heated Raven Johnson draft debate, even whispers of ticket boycotts starting to circulate, all stacking up, one after another, creating a tension that felt impossible to ignore. Now, anyone grounded in analytics will tell you correlation isn't always causation, that television ratings are influenced by countless moving parts. And that's fair. But there's also a truth here that doesn't need overcomplication, something clear and powerful. The Caitlin Clark fanbase isn't just large, it's historic, an economic engine unlike anything women's basketball has seen before. They fill arenas, they drive record-breaking ratings, they turn games into events. And for 2 straight weeks leading into that preseason matchup, the messaging coming out of the Indiana Fever didn't pull them closer, it pushed them away. The idea of moving Clark off the ball, of redefining her as a versatile piece rather than the centerpiece, quietly signaled a shift that struck directly at what fans love most. Because what draws people in isn't subtle. It's Clark with the ball, controlling tempo, pushing pace, creating chaos in transition, launching impossible passes and deep threes that feel almost unreal. So imagine being a casual fan who tuned in during 2024 just to witness that spectacle, only to hear for 2 straight weeks that the new system might slow it down, limit it, reshape it into something more controlled, more restrained. Does that same excitement stay intact? Or does hesitation creep in, that thought of waiting, of seeing how it looks before fully committing time and attention? The recent economic rise of the WNBA has been deeply tied to Clark's style of play, not as an opinion, but as something backed by viewership trends, by numbers that consistently show millions tuning in when she's orchestrating the game at full speed, and a noticeable dip when that role becomes reduced, when she's shifted into a slower, more structured system that dulls the very edge that makes her special. Yet during those 2 weeks, the conversation from within the organization kept drifting away from that identity, focusing on versatility, on system fit, on everything except the one message fans were waiting to hear, that Clark is the engine, the point guard, the show itself, and that her presence with the ball is what transforms games into must-watch moments. And then the numbers come in, dropping from 1.3 million to 743,000, and suddenly it feels less surprising and more like a direct response, like the audience quietly reacting to what they were being told. Because in the end, this isn't complicated, it's simple in the way powerful truths often are. Clark is the product, the centerpiece, the reason millions tune in, a driving force behind massive deals and growing attention. And the path forward feels just as clear. Protect what makes her unique, lean into it fully, build everything around it, and let her do what she does best. Because that's where the magic lives, and that's what people are really coming to see.
The players that aren't going to play. Stephanie White said she doesn't anticipate playing Aaliyah Boston, Ty Harris, or Lexi Hull tomorrow in the preseason game against Dallas. Quote, I think we still probably be cautious with that. I think the goal is to probably get some of them minutes on Saturday if we can. What do you mean, if we can? Can you or not? What are we doing?
And as if
And as if stepping away from that explosive transition identity wasn't already enough to stir concern, the front office now seems to be testing something even more fragile: the trust of the fans who actually buy the tickets, through messaging that feels unclear, incomplete, and increasingly hard to believe. Stephanie White released an injury update that raised more questions than answers, listing key pieces like Aaliyah Boston, Lexi Hall, and Natasha Cloud as dealing with undisclosed issues, and then followed it with uncertainty, saying they would probably be cautious and might get minutes if we can, a phrase that lingers because no one really knows what it means. What exactly is "if we can"? What's actually going on behind the scenes, especially when it comes to something as vague as a lower leg injury for Boston? That lack of clarity has started to create distance, and a growing part of the Indiana Fever fan base is beginning to question whether they're getting the full picture. Because when communication feels guarded, trust doesn't hold, and once that credibility starts to slip, it's not easy to rebuild. And all of this is happening right as the spotlight is about to intensify, with the regular season opener on May 9th against the loaded Dallas Wings, a matchup that carries its own storyline, with Paige Buchers going head-to-head with Caitlin Clark, a game already positioned to draw massive attention far beyond anything the preseason could offer. If White pivots, abandons the off-ball experiments, and puts the game back where fans expect it, in Clark's hands, pushing tempo, dictating pace, creating that high-speed chaos that defines her style, then the ratings won't just recover, they could explode into something spectacular. But if the coaching staff stays locked into these slower, restrictive systems, paired with unclear injury updates and rigid rotations that pull the ball away from Clark, the risk becomes very real, because casual fans don't wait forever, and once they start drifting, history shows they don't return easily. The WNBA has been building momentum, but momentum depends on connection, and right now that connection feels strained. This isn't just a warning, it's a moment of decision, because the numbers have already started to reflect the shift, and the message is becoming impossible to ignore. The Fever cannot afford to misread the power of the Clark-driven audience, not now, not at this scale. And beyond the analysis, there's also a community forming around these conversations, voices that keep pushing for clarity, for accountability, for deeper understanding of what's really happening on and off the court, a group that values sharp, fearless breakdowns and refuses to settle for surface-level narratives. So now the question turns outward. Are these falling ratings a genuine organizational issue, or just noise that fades once the real games begin? Will these coaching choices reshape how fans engage with the team, or will adjustments come in time to restore that electric connection? And most importantly, should the front office step in and bring the focus back to what clearly works? The regular season is just days away. The spotlight is only getting brighter, and every decision from here will carry weight, because this time, everyone is watching closely.